Hi, everybody. This is Silvio Canto in Dallas, Texas on Friday, June the 16th. And welcome to our commentary. What a treat we have for you today, particularly our friends in Babalu who are going to be watching this on Friday night or over the weekend. But that gentleman there on the other side of the screen, our good friend, Dr. Carlos Eire, who has been my virtual friend for about 10 years, although I feel like I've known you longer. I think that's one of
Yeah,
the things that happens. And it just seems like it's been longer than 10 years that we met through the internet. And tonight we're going to remember the story of Babalu 20 years ago. Both of us contribute in the Babalu project. And we're just going to talk in general about Cuba. So let me say welcome, Carlos. Un gran abrazo to you,
igualmente.
to welcome to our video. Carlos, you and I guess, are almost from the same generation, a couple of years apart. So I'm a couple of years younger, but I'll give you the benefit of the doubt and say we're the same generation.
Yeah,
But uh, I was always fascinated by this story in your book, Waiting for Snow in Havana. But this is a story that I've shared this story with other people, even those who have not read the book. And the story is December 31st, 1958. You and your parents are driving home from a wedding, and your mother says that things look kind of peaceful, kind of quiet in Havana. And of course, I was probably, who knows where I was that day? I don't quite remember, but I was at home, I'm sure, waiting for my parents to celebrate that night too. And when you think back at that night and how that night changed you and me, it's hard to, who could have imagined
no,
that night, what eventually happened, Carlos? Who would have
yeah.
imagined,
Well,
Carlos?
my mom was kind of spooked because the streets were too quiet. Right, there was supposed to be more partying going on, I guess, but yeah, no, she was very spooked by it all. My dad, I mean, maybe my memory's faulty, but I think my dad remained fairly silent about
Yeah.
what was going on. But the following morning, boom,
Yes.
he was the one who broke the news to me. He walked
Yes.
into my bedroom and said, Batista se fue. Batista has
Right.
left the country, right?
Right.
And then throughout the day, everybody was talking about, well, what's next? What's next? And my father, oddly enough, because, he didn't do anything about it, he said, this man is no good.
Mm-hmm.
This Fidel character, he's a gangster.
Mm-hmm.
He's killed people. He's probably a communist. This man is no good.
Right. Well, your
And
father, your father got it right. I will confess, my parents had mixed feelings. My parents were not Batistianos, so they had mixed feelings.
right.
But they were, I mean, they were not necessarily, they weren't necessarily rooting for Batista to leave. They were caught by surprise. But what I remember the next morning was my mother fixing us breakfast, pan con leche, which is a very
Uh-huh.
popular, as you remember that.
Yes.
And my mother feeding us, right, pan con leche, and then and then my dad on the phone, and there was a TV on with the news, and it just, I don't, honestly, I didn't make much of it. I mean, but my parents were aware that there was a big change. But I mentioned to you before we started that there's not an expert in the world in 1958 or 59 now, the next day, who would have predicted this. If you had put the biggest experts about
Yeah.
Cuba in a room in December 1958, and you had said to them, "This is what's going to happen," nobody would have believed you, Carlos.
No, no, they would have thought you were insane. They might have sent you to Masorra, the insane
Mazorra.
insane asylum.
That's right. They probably would have sent you there. And I think maybe the reason, Carlos, and I remember talking to my father about this, my late father. Um, I think the reason is because nobody expected the United States to put up with it too long.
Yeah.
I mean, I think there was a sense, and a bad idea that we believed this, but there was a sense, no, los americanos no van a tolerar esto.
No,
And
I mean, it wasn't just Cold War. It was the fact that, the United States had had the so-called Monroe Doctrine in effect for so long, and they never hesitated to interfere in other countries, including Cuba, where they interfered several times since 1902. So the reason, to this day, I think the main reason that this dictatorship has lasted so long was that President John Kennedy betrayed the Brigade 2506 men who had landed. Everybody knows it as the Bay of Pigs. Well, he betrayed them. There was a plan. The United States that was not going to interfere directly. They found 1,500 some brave young Cubans, some in their early teens, and some were actually World War II veterans. That they didn't deliver the promised support. They left them stranded on the beach.
Right.
That
Now
was it.
you were already here when that happened, right?
No, I was there when the invasion.
You were still there, okay? Because I was
Yeah.
there. I remember that as much as
yeah.
I can remember. I remember an airplane flying over our home.
I do too. And
dropping leaflets. Remember there were leaflets?
They were dropping bombs near my house.
Oh, really? Well,
because I lived just a few blocks, maybe 10 blocks or so, 12 at most, from Columbia Airfield.
Oh, okay.
Which they bombed, but they failed. They failed. They didn't destroy Castro's airplanes.
Yeah. Yes.
But the bombs were exploding really close to my house. And my next door neighbor, who was the neighborhood snitch, the Comité de Defensa, he got up on his roof and was firing a pistol at these B-26s.
Right. Yeah, the B-26. I didn't know at the time that it was a B-26, but flew by. We used to live in, remember Paseo that would go north-south and it would end up at the Malecón?
Yes.
So we used to live maybe 2 blocks away from the water.
Oh, wow.
Bahia de La Habana, right? And near us was the hotel. Oh my gosh, it's not the Nacional. It's the other one that was down in the Malecón. It'll come Riviera. Hotel Riviera. We used to live within walking distance of that. In fact, my brother and I used to play baseball a few years later. We used to play baseball in that park that they had there over by the El Riviera. We used to play baseball there. They had this big park that was just there. And we used to play baseball. So we were close. But what I remember was an airplane dropping leaflets. And I didn't know that it was a B-26 until later when I became acquainted with the aircraft. But it was clearly 4 props. That much I remember.
Yeah, they were all World War II vintage airplanes. And they were painted to look like Cuban Air Force planes.
Right.
I remember that afterwards.
Yeah.
But anyway, it was
that much detail I don't remember. I just remember the plane flying by, and my brother and I were looking out the window and saw this plane going by, which of course we didn't live anywhere near an airport, so we were not accustomed to seeing airplanes flying by. But then of course that book or that incident and you're leaving Cuba inspired you to write the book Waiting for Snow in Havana. And you were part of what came to be known as Pedro Pan. It was not called Pedro Pan back then.
It didn't have
I'm not
a name.
sure. Yeah, I don't know what they used to call it then, but you were part of that and you came here. Your mother and father stayed behind, but I think you came with your brother, right? If I recall from your book.
Yeah. Yep. He was 3 years older.
Yeah. And what year was that, Carlos, that you left?
62, April 6th, 1962.
So it's funny how the calendar works because that program pretty much ended in October during the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Yes.
So you were 8 months earlier, I guess. And
in my case, though, the October Missile Crisis had intense personal ramifications
Mm.
because my mother had her exit permit for November 7th.
Oh.
So I was expecting to be reunited with my mom in a week and a half to 2 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
And all of a sudden, my foster mother shows me the newspaper, Miami Herald, I think it was. Um, she couldn't say it to me.
Right.
She said, "Here, read this."
Mm-hmm.
And it was the article that said that because of the missile crisis, Fidel had closed down all airports
Yeah.
and nobody could leave.
Well, it also had an impact on us too, because we were hoping to leave
Yeah.
like others, not with Pedro Pan, not the Pedro Pan program,
Right.
but as a family. And that made us have to go through Mexico. So
Yep.
we actually had to leave through Mexico, Jamaica, and then come to the US.
And what
So
year was that?
in 64, because
Yeah,
we
that's
left
right.
in July. See, we left. Here's a funny thing. We left on July the 2nd, 1964. And that happened to be Jose Canseco's birthday. So I just saw that one day, I was looking at his biography and I said, my gosh, I was leaving Cuba the day Jose Canseco was born. I just always thought that was one of those funny
Well,
coincidences. But you left, and of course, here we are. And this is
yeah.
again the part that I always find so amazing. That I don't know, when we left, I have no idea if my parents thought this was forever or not. I think they were always hopeful that
Oh,
there
yeah.
would be a change in Cuba and they could
Yeah.
return. But obviously, as time went by, that became
Yeah.
less likely. But
Yeah.
Waiting for Snow in Havana, I always thought the title was wonderful. Tell me again. I know you told me before when we did a podcast a few years ago, but how did that title happen? Because it's such a great title, Waiting for Snow in
Well,
Havana.
the thing is, before I sat down to write the book, I had a title for it, but it wasn't Waiting for Snow in Havana. The title I had, um, eventually my editor and publisher would not allow me to use. The original title was Kiss the Lizard Jesus, because my character's name was Jesus.
Right.
Anyway, so that when they told me I couldn't use that, I got really mad, angry. So I came up with 250 titles, alternative titles, many of them variations on a theme. And on the list was Waiting for Snow in Havana. But that was actually a different version of a Monty Python skit, the Dead Parrot skit, where man brings a dead parrot back to the pet store, and the pet store owner keeps insisting, no, he's not dead. He's a Norwegian parrot. And then at one
Right.
point, says, oh no, he's only pining for fjords.
No, I tell you, we're dating ourselves when we talk about Monty Python humor. But I
Well,
would recommend Monty Python humor to anybody. In fact, there was a reason one of their episodes or whatever was in the news lately, because in one of the episodes, one of them wants to be a woman. Did you remember that one where one of them says that he wants to be a woman? And of course, that has become popular now.
yes, absolutely. But
And
the
that's
thing is, the title is not just a ripoff from Monty Python.
right.
As a kid, I was desperate to see snow,
Oh, I see.
and I wanted snow in Havana. I actually thought was one day, must have been about 8 years old, looking at a map of the world, and I realized, and this was true back then, the only countries that made stuff, the only countries that were wealthy were in cold climates, right? Including
True.
Australia and New Zealand. And of course, back then, Argentina was like, one of the most,
Prosperous,
perhaps the
yeah.
best economy in all of the former Spanish colonies.
Right.
And I attributed it to weather, the fact that we were so hot in Cuba. We could use a little snow, things would be better.
That's right. No, you mentioned Argentina. It reminded me of when we first left Cuba, and I would study Cuban history and the Cuban economy and so on pre-Castro. It seemed like every time I would go to the Encyclopedia Britannica or any other sources back then, it was a little different than it is now. That Cuba, on things like life expectancy and literacy,
Mhm.
would always be like number one, number two, number three with Argentina and Uruguay. It was always like Argentina, Uruguay, Chile,
Right.
and Cuba would be in
Yep.
that ranking. Well, I mentioned, and which is the big reason that I wanted to with you today is as we celebrate 20 years of the Babalu blog, I came in probably sometime around 2010. That's when I came in, and I got more active in 2013. When did you first join the Babalu blog, or when did you start writing?
I can't fix a date on it. It was about that same time, more or less. I started
Yeah.
off slowly and gradually.
Mm-hmm.
And it was, I remember I got an email from Val Prieto, the
Valpriet, yeah,
founder of Babalu Blog.
that's right.
And he had a question to put to me about the feast of San Lazaro, St. Lazarus, right? So I wrote back to him and we started writing back and forth. And I started reading Babalu. And at that time, I was very, very much still very much consumed by the success of my book and talking. I there's one year when I gave over 100 talks on waiting for snow in Havana.
Wow.
So I was in thickly embedded in the whole Cuba thing and talking about Cuba
Mm-hmm.
and keeping up with news and so on. And I liked the way that Val wrote. He wrote some beautiful pieces,
Mm-hmm.
a very
Yeah.
personal of a very personal nature,
Yeah.
right? And I thought, well, this is one way. I realized what was going on.
Right.
What was going on was that the Val and now Alberto de la Cruz, they're from a younger generation of
Mm-hmm.
Cubans, younger than you and me, and they were more Americanized than
Mm-hmm.
you and I could ever be
Yeah. Well,
because
I think Alberto was born in
was
the
born
United
here.
States.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
right.
I'm not sure about Valentin, but I think Alberto definitely was.
Yeah, yep. But
Yeah.
they were very comfortable writing in English.
Yeah,
For
no, I love them. That's how kind of I got together with him, was that way through Val and through Alberto, connected with him. Now I have to tell you that the first time I contributed something, what really attracted me to contribute to Babalu was the fact that I always wanted to write about Cuban baseball,
uh
and it just became the perfect place to write about Cuban baseball, because Cuba has such a history of baseball that
yeah,
we sometimes don't. I mean, I am amazed at how much Cuban baseball, the history that I used to talk to my late father about. So that's what attracted me. And then I would sometimes also write some political things. But the fact that it's been around for 20 years, and I really want to congratulate Val and Alberto for the fact that they stuck with it, and they've made it into what it is now, a great website. I think it's the number one, what I like to call Cuban American website in
yeah.
the
Well, it's
country. I
just
mean,
it's in English, and
yes,
it opens up um, our perspective, Cuban exile perspective, to I don't know how many, but many
yeah,
uh, who only speak English and can only read in English here in this country,
that's right. No,
non-Cubans
you're right.
and
You're right. I mean,
non-Hispanics.
and I think even for people like you and me who were born there and but grew up in the United States, sometimes for me it's a little bit easier to read in English than in Spanish. I can read in Spanish, but I can read better in English. So I
Actually,
think that's the reason that maybe it's attracted to me as
yeah.
well.
Yes, and especially, I'm sure you have the same memory because we learned English, and we were all received so much of our education in English. Every time I picked up this Cuban newspaper, Diario Las Americas, they used Baroque Spanish. They wrote like they were in the 17th century.
Right.
I had, I had trouble understanding what was
Yeah.
going on. And actually, it's very funny because last week or the week before, um, Alberto sent to me the Cuban cartoonist Antonio Proyas,
Right.
who's best known for the Spy versus Spy comics in Mad Magazine. He was Cuban. He fled Cuba. Alberto gave me the resignation letter that Proyas turned into his newspaper. It took me about 5 hours to translate it because he wrote the same way. It was it was beautiful.
Right.
It was sheer poetry, but boy, it not accessible to even someone whose mother tongue
Right.
was Spanish.
Well, let me tell you something about Diario de las Américas, because that became my father's favorite newspaper.
Yeah,
Now,
yeah.
we didn't read it. We used to get it in the mail because we lived
Yes,
in Wisconsin.
Wisconsin. Yes, my
So
mom got it in Chicago.
yeah, so we used to get this, little newspaper in plastic in the mail.
Right.
And I remember my father used to love their editorials because their editorials were in English and in Spanish.
Yeah.
And my father would remember that they were in both
Yes,
languages.
Yeah.
And my father used to love them. My father used to love them.
Yeah.
And I, we would often talk about it in the table, dinner table. And one of my regrets is that we didn't save any of them.
No, they're probably digitized.
Yeah, I'm sure they are. I'm
Oh.
sure they are. But the idea that I could hold in my hands back then a newspaper, and the other thing that happened with my father too and my parents, my father used to get a monthly newsletter called El Enduso. Now, Enduso was a river or something near Sabana La Grande where he was from. So there was a community of exiles from Sabana La Grande of his generation who used to publish this newsletter in the United States and actually all around the world. And they used to get this and my father would say, "Oh, look at this guy here who's a doctor. He was a friend of mine in Sabana La Grande." And it became a real treat for us to get those things because it kept us connected to Cuba. Because and I think we talked about it one time, that you come here, you get involved in the U.S. in school, in high school, and then college and so on. You don't intentionally disconnect, but you have a hard time staying connected because everything else around you. And so, for a while there, it just took me a while I wasn't avoiding Cuba because I would always have it with my parents, but it wasn't really until Mariel that I sort of all of a sudden got hit between the eyes. And I said, these people are leaving the place where I left. And that's when it was that, I guess, 1980. It was then that I became very connected with Cuba and have been ever since. They have had a tremendous interest ever thing. I think you mentioned to me one time, or I read in one of your articles, that what you reconnected was the story of the young boy Adrian, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's. I had spent many, many years. For me, given the business I'm in, higher education, I got so tired of when people ask me, "Oh, where are you from?" and I would say Cuba. Then I'd have to hear their little mini lecture on how wonderful the Cuban Revolution was, blah, blah, blah. Or they would ask me, how much property my family owned. And, or, I would have to sit and listen to all the nonsense and if I countered with the real history, then I would immediately feel hostility. So, for a while there, it was all too painful to me, and I just let go of it.
No, I can understand that. I can
But
understand
then
that.
I also lived in places where there were very few Cubans.
Same here, same experience.
Right. So I came to Yale, 1996, and there were 3 Cubans on the faculty. One of them from Sagua La Grande.
Oh my goodness, that is cool.
And the baseball connection, Roberto González Echevarria, who wrote the book in English.
The Pride of Havana, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
On Cuban baseball.
Yeah.
So I immediately met these Cuban intellectuals who kind of reawakened in me my Cubanness.
Right.
or sometimes just a single word that they would say. Especially Roberto is a beautiful writer in both languages, English
Yeah.
and Spanish. But um, I still remember one time one of my colleagues, one of the three, said to me, we were just joking around, and she said, "Prepárate."
Yeah.
And oh God, that word! I said, well, that word has such depth of meaning for me. There's no English word that has, because that's when your parents threaten you. You've
Right.
done,
Right.
you've done something bad. You say, "Prepárate." Oh,
Prepárate. Right.
get
Right.
ready.
Right.
Oh God. And then I realized, I had all this Cuban stuff buried in me, including all those memories.
Yeah.
Uh,
Well, there's two Cuban expressions that come from baseball that my parents would use all the time, and I've never been able to forget them. I use them now. The first one is la bola pica y se extiende. When la bola pica y se extiende, which means the problem is getting more complicated. That's kind of what it
oh,
means. Because in baseball, the ball lands and it keeps going, which means that it turns a single into a double or triple or whatever. So la bola pica y se extiende. That was a phrase that my parents would always use when things were getting complicated. And the other one is te pusieron en 3-2 o estás en 3-2, which is another
oh,
way of saying that you got to make a decision, in the next bit.
yeah.
So stuff like that I would hear from my parents all the time, or expressions that come from baseball, but I don't even think the people who use them are baseball fans. They're just part of the Cuban language, I guess,
Yeah.
or Cuban
Yeah.
slang.
But
Well,
baseball
yeah,
was the bane of my existence as in junior high school, because everybody at Bloomington Junior High School in Illinois expected me to be good at baseball, but I was terrible, just terrible. And when I struck out one time, it's one of the more unpleasant experiences I've had. I won't finish the story, but yeah. And they also expected me to be a good dancer, and I can't dance, so
I
I was
know
always disappointed.
dancing and baseball are supposed to be expertises we all have.
Yeah, but I don't.
But I'll tell you one thing, Carlos. If you were living in Chicago, there's a tradition, or near Chicago. One of the great Cuban baseball players played for the White Sox, of course. Orestes Miñoso, or known up here as
Yeah,
Mini Miñoso.
mini
So
minnow. Yeah, yeah.
that is why. Well, let me. We're almost running out of time. I guess we're going to have to do this more than once, as we say, as we honor Babalu in 20 years. But let me just pick up one last topic here about Cuba today. It seems, and you've been writing a lot about this, it seems like Cuba is for sale. I
Oh,
mean, there is a map that I think you or somebody, or maybe Alberto, or you posted the other day of the island of Cuba and all these little parts.
yeah,
Cuba is literally for sale,
yeah.
and it's pathetic. But I
Well,
think the calculation, Carlos, I think the calculation they're making is they need somebody else to subsidize them. I guess that's what they're making.
they have run out of everything. One of the posts I put up on Babalu today, I think it was my 6 o'clock post. Um, there's a brewery in Santi Spiritus, does not have sugar. They can't find any sugar in Cuba.
I know that's
And what was the other one, which was also absolutely ridiculous? Oh, the storm that just battered the eastern half of Cuba damaged many roads. There is zero asphalt available to fix the roads. It's
I
going to
know.
be so
It is.
they're broke.
They're broke.
Everything is in disrepair, and they have no way that. So they have to sell the country to the highest bidder.
That's it. And the infrastructure is collapsing. The countries that used to lend them money, even friendly countries like Mexico, they've had to reschedule their debts. They don't have any ability to get any fresh money, so they're basically just selling the island.
Yeah.
And it's I don't know how much longer that's going to last, but it may just solidify them enough to last a little bit longer.
Well,
I always ask the question, because I remember the last time we spoke was about, well, not the last time we spoke, but one time we spoke was, remember that article that you wrote between 2012 and 2013 that you compared Cuba before like 50
Right.
years of,
Yeah.
remember that article that you
Yeah.
wrote? And that article, I've used that article many times as a source of information. And I remember saying this when we spoke that night, that how much more can this nation
Oh,
decline? I mean, how much more can a nation decline? And I am convinced that in the case of Cuba, that question cannot be answered.
it can keep declining till they're back in the Stone Age. And if these very vile men who run the place keep running it the way they want to run it, and are able to terrorize enough people to keep them subject to them, they can go back to live in the caves.
That's right. Nobody's going to care because nobody's going to write any international editorials about that.
No.
I mean, so
not only that, I don't know if you got these questions too as a kid in Wisconsin. When the people, other kids found out you were from Cuba, get these kind of questions like, what did it feel like to wear shoes for the first time?
right.
Oh, you had underwear. Oh my God, you had. So people expect Cuba. People around the world expect Cuba to be third world or sub-third world to begin with.
Right.
And that's one reason that people don't care, because they believe all this crap about the medical missions of Cuba and free health care and free education and all this,
Right.
which is all total lies. It's all bogus.
That's right.
But people don't care, and they go there to have fun. Canadians especially. 1 million Canadians a year go to Cuba for vacations, and they go to their apartheid hotels and have a great time.
They go to these beaches where, as I say, they're apartheid, like you said, and they get to enjoy those little parts of Cuba that are beautiful, the beaches and so on. They don't interact with people. They don't care about interacting with the Cuban people, and the disaster goes on. Carlos, I want to thank you so much for joining me today. I think we will do this again.
Sure, anytime.
And maybe the next time. I wanted to do this especially for Babalu because of the 20 years, and I wanted to salute Babalu for 20 years. But what I like to do is maybe do it more frequently and talk more about Cuba and some of the problems of Cuba that we both mentioned. So I want to thank you very much for your time today. And I guess it's where you are right now. I think it's Connecticut, so it's pretty humid there, isn't it?
It is, and we were supposed to get some more Canadian smoke.
Oh, that's right.
Today, but it didn't show up. But last week, oh my God,
show up.
I've never seen anything like it. The sky was orange.
Yeah, I spoke to a friend in New York who said exactly that. They had to cancel the baseball game.
Yes, that's right.
They had to cancel the baseball game because of that.
And they closed down LaGuardia Airport.
Because people, I guess, couldn't. The pilots couldn't see. But I want to thank you so much for joining me today, and we will do it again and again. I think both you and I salute Val and Alberto for the great work that they've done at Babalu, and we're just lucky to be a part of it. But they're the two guys who stuck with it, and they're the ones who get congratulated. And there's others too. I know I don't want to leave anybody out. I think Alberto has contributed as well, but definitely Val and Alberto are the two who've been carrying that load, and we want to salute both of them. I think on behalf of the many readers for the great work that they've done. So, Carlos, thank you so much, and we will do it again. I promise. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Silvio.
Thank you so much. Our good friend Carlos Eire, professor, fellow Cuban. We both came here as youngsters, and now we've gotten old in the United States, and it's interesting looking back at our lives and how similar they were. We both came. Our family went to Wisconsin. His family, well, he and his brother went to the Midwest as well, and so we had that common experience. And then growing up here, getting old in the United States, it's an amazing thing that I guarantee you none of our parents predicted this when they had us back in the 1950s, that we would grow up, get out of Cuba, and live grow old in the United States, but that's the way it turned out. And I've always been, of course, very grateful to the United States for the opportunity. Thank you for listening. This is Silvio Canto in Dallas. Those of you over at Babalu, you'll get to see this video over the weekend. It'll be there for you to catch up with it. Thank you very much. This is Silvio Canto in Dallas, and we'll talk to you later. Let me say hello to a couple of people who joined us today. My friend I Am and a couple of others who commented on the show today. Thank you so much for joining in. Thank you very much.